The year is 1929. Autumn has settled over Somerset like a grey burial shroud. The leaves have long since fallen from the ancient yew trees that line the avenue leading to Montacute House, and the branches stand naked against a sky the colour of pewter. Inside the mansion, the rooms are silent. Not the comfortable silence of a home between meals, not the hushed reverence of a cathedral at dawn, but the silence of abandonment. The silence of something that has been left behind. The great chimneys that once exhaled warmth and smoke into the Somerset sky now stand cold and still. The windows that once blazed with candlelight in the evenings, casting golden rectangles across the gardens, now stare out at the world like hollow eye sockets. And on the doorstep of this three-storey masterpiece of Elizabethan architecture, a man in a threadbare coat stands with a clipboard, and he is writing down a number. A single number that will determine the fate of a building that has stood for over 300 years. The number he writes is £5,882. That is the scrap value of Montacute House. Not its worth as a piece of history, not its value as one of the finest surviving examples of English Renaissance architecture, not the centuries of memory held within its Ham Hill stone walls. Its scrap value, the value of the stone if it were broken apart and carted away to be used as building material somewhere else, £5,882, and in that single, devastating number lies the beginning of one of the most extraordinary survival stories in the history of English country houses. Because Montacute House did not disappear. It did not crumble into ruin. It did not burn down in a wartime raid or fall victim to a careless landlord's neglect. It survived. And the story of how it survived is just as remarkable as the story of how it was built. This is the story of Montacute House, a mansion built in about 1598 in the village of Montacute in South Somerset, England. A house constructed of golden Ham Hill stone, the same warm, honey-coloured limestone that has been quarried from the hills of Somerset for centuries. A house with a long gallery stretching 172 feet from end to end, the longest surviving long gallery in all of England. A house that was once valued at less than £6,000 in scrap. A house that is now a Grade 1 listed building, one of the finest examples of late Elizabethan architecture in the entire country. A house that has been home to a Speaker of the House of Commons, to a man arrested for treason, to a gambler who destroyed his family's fortune, to a marquis and his famous mistress, to American soldiers preparing for the invasion of Normandy, and finally, to over 183,000 visitors a year, who walk through its doors to glimpse a world that vanished 4 centuries ago. To understand how all of this happened, we need to go back much further than 1929. We need to go back to the very foundations of the Phelips family, to the Somerset countryside in the 15th century, and to the slow, patient generational climb of a family of yeoman farmers into the ranks of the English gentry. And we need to understand something about the England in which Montacute was built, because Montacute House is not merely a building, it is a mirror in which we can see reflected the ambitions, the anxieties, the cultural upheavals, and the architectural revolutions of one of the most turbulent periods in English history. The Elizabethan age, the age of Shakespeare, the age of the Spanish Armada, the age when England was transforming itself from a medieval kingdom into something entirely new. If you find this story compelling, if you feel drawn into the world of Montacute and want to know more about the extraordinary mansions and estates of England, please subscribe to this channel. Stories like this one deserve to be told, and they deserve to be heard. The village of Montacute sits in the county of Somerset, in the southwest of England. It is a small place, unremarkable to the casual observer, a cluster of stone cottages, and a church nestled into the gentle folds of the Somerset levels. But beneath that quiet surface lies a history that stretches back millennia. The Romans were here, the Saxons were here, and long before Montacute House was built, the Phelips family was here. The family had lived in the Montacute area since at least 1460. That is the earliest date we can confirm with certainty, though it is entirely possible that their roots in this particular patch of Somerset stretch back even further. In those early days, the Phelipses were yeoman farmers, not aristocrats, not gentry, not even particularly wealthy by the standards of the time. They were working people. People who labored the land, who grew their crops, who raised their livestock, and who measured their success not in titles or grand houses, but in the health of their harvests and the survival of their children through another Somerset winter. But England in the 15th and 16th centuries was a country in motion. The rigid hierarchies of the medieval world were beginning, slowly and painfully, to crack. The Tudor monarchs, first Henry VII, and then the magnificent and terrifying Henry VIII, were reshaping the English state. The dissolution of the monasteries, which took place between 1536 and 1541, was perhaps the single most significant redistribution of land and wealth in English history up to that point. Vast tracts of land that had been owned by the Catholic Church for centuries were suddenly seized by the Crown and then sold off, often at bargain prices, to courtiers, merchants, and ambitious local gentry who were eager to expand their holdings. And it was through this upheaval that the Phelips family began their ascent. The site on which Montacute House now stands was bought from the Cluniac Montacute Priory, one of the religious houses that was dissolved during the Tudors' sweeping reforms. The priory's lands, like those of so many dissolved monasteries, were dispersed, sold, redistributed. And the Phelips family, with the shrewd instinct for opportunity that would characterize them for generations, acquired this particular piece of Somerset ground. The man who made the purchase was Thomas Phelips, and Thomas Phelips began to plan a new house on the site. Not a farmhouse, not a modest dwelling suitable for a yeoman farmer. A mansion, a statement, a building that would announce to the world that the Phelips family had arrived. But Thomas Phelips never saw his dream realized. He died before the house could be built, and the responsibility for completing his vision fell to his grandson, also called Thomas. And when that second Thomas also died before the construction could begin, the project passed finally to his son, to Edward Phelips, Sir Edward Phelips, the man who would build Montacute House and who would, in the process, become one of the most important political figures of the early 17th century. Edward Phelips was a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but a lawyer of extraordinary ability, a man whose legal mind was sharp enough to navigate the treacherous political waters of the Tudor and early Stuart courts. He had been in Parliament since 1584, a young man making his mark in the halls of Westminster, and by 1603, the year that Queen Elizabeth I died and James I of Scotland took the English throne, Phelips had established himself as a figure of genuine influence. In 1603 he was knighted, Sir Edward Phelips, and a year later, in 1604, he was elected Speaker of the House of Commons, the presiding officer of the lower house of Parliament, one of the most powerful and visible political positions in England. He would hold that role until 1611. Think about what that means. The man who built Montacute House was not a minor local squire. He was not a gentleman farmer with modest ambitions and a comfortable inheritance. He was the Speaker of the House of Commons of England. A man at the very heart of the nation's political life. A man who dined with kings and argued with lords. A man whose name and reputation were known throughout the land. And he chose to build his home in a small village in Somerset, on the site of a dissolved priory, using the skills of local masons and the stone from the hills around him. Why? The answer lies in something that the English gentry understood perhaps better than anyone in Europe. The answer is roots. The Phelips family had been in Montacute for generations. Their dead were buried in the churchyard. Their name was carved into the stones of the village. To build elsewhere would have been to sever themselves from the very thing that gave them their identity, their legitimacy, their place in the social order. An English gentleman might rise to the highest offices of the state, but he always kept one foot planted firmly in the county where his family had lived for centuries. That was not weakness, that was wisdom. And so Edward Phelips, Speaker of the House of Commons, turned his attention to building Montacute House. Now, the question of who actually designed the building is one of the small mysteries that surrounds its history. The architect's identity is unknown. We do not have a signed drawing, a contract, a letter of commission. The records, so far as they survive, do not tell us the name of the man who conceived the shape of Montacute House. However, architectural historians have proposed a candidate, a mason named William Arnold. Arnold was a Somerset man himself, a craftsman of considerable skill and reputation who was responsible for the designs of two other notable buildings, Cranbourne Manor in Dorset and Wadham College in Oxford. He had also worked at Dunster Castle, also in Somerset, and when scholars compare the architectural details of Dunster with those found at Montacute, they find striking similarities. The same motifs, the same proportions, the same instinctive understanding of how to combine the old and the new in a way that felt both innovative and deeply rooted in English tradition. Whether Arnold was indeed the designer of Montacute House, we cannot say with absolute certainty. But the circumstantial evidence is compelling, and his name has become closely associated with the building in the minds of those who study it. What we can say with confidence is that the construction of Montacute House began around 1598 or 1599. The date is not precisely documented in any surviving record, but it has been deduced from dates found on a fireplace and in stained glass within the house. And the date 1601, which is engraved above a door case, is generally considered to be the year in which construction was completed. So the house was built in approximately 3 years. 3 years to transform a patch of Somerset farmland into one of the finest mansions in the county. 3 years to quarry and dress the stone, to raise the walls, to set the windows, to carve the gables, to create a building that would endure for over 4 centuries. Let us talk about that stone, because it is central to understanding Montacute House. The mansion is constructed of Ham Hill stone, a type of limestone quarried from Ham Hill, which rises just to the south of the village of Montacute. Ham Hill stone is one of the most distinctive building materials in England. It is a honey-coloured limestone, warm and golden when freshly cut, mellowing over time to a deeper, more weathered tone that catches the light in subtle and beautiful ways. It is relatively soft, which makes it easy to carve and dress, but it is also remarkably durable, capable of withstanding centuries of Somerset weather without significant deterioration. Ham Hill stone had been used in construction in Somerset since Roman times. The Romans quarried it. The Saxons quarried it. The monks of the local monasteries quarried it to build their churches and priories. And when Edward Phelips decided to build Montacute House, he turned to the same hills, the same quarries, the same stone that had been providing building material for this corner of England for over 1,000 years. There was something deeply appropriate about this choice. Montacute House was to be a statement of arrival, a declaration that the Phelips family had risen from yeomen to gentry. But it was also, by its very construction, a statement of continuity. A building made of the same stone that had been used to build the priory from which the family had acquired their land. A building that drew its physical substance from the hills on which the family had lived and worked for generations. The stone itself was an act of rootedness. Now, to understand the architectural style of Montacute House, we need to understand something about the England of 1598, because this was a country caught between two worlds. The medieval world was dying, the Renaissance world was being born, and architecture, like everything else in English life, was caught in the middle, pulled in two directions at once, struggling to find a language that could express the new reality without entirely abandoning the old. The style in which Montacute House was built is generally described as English Renaissance, sometimes also called Elizabethan. But these terms are somewhat misleading, because English Renaissance architecture was not the same thing as the Renaissance architecture of Italy or France. On the continent, the Renaissance was a conscious revolution, a deliberate rejection of medieval forms in favor of the classical proportions and symmetry of ancient Rome and Greece. Architects like Brunelleschi and Palladio looked to the ruins of antiquity for their inspiration, and they built accordingly, with an emphasis on rational geometry, mathematical proportion, and the clean lines of classical orders. In England, by contrast, the process was slower, messier, and in many ways more interesting. English architects did not simply discard the Gothic tradition and replace it with something imported from Italy. Instead, they absorbed Renaissance ideas gradually, selectively, mixing them with the Gothic forms they already knew, creating a hybrid style that was uniquely English. And Montacute House is one of the finest surviving examples of this hybrid. Look at the east front of the house, the facade that was originally intended as the principal entrance. You will see Dutch gables, those distinctive stepped or curved gable ends, that were a hallmark of the early English Renaissance, a feature that travelled from France across the Low Countries and into England as the Renaissance style spread northward across Europe. But alongside those Dutch gables, you will also see Gothic pinnacles, obelisk-shaped projections that reach upward like stone fingers pointing toward heaven, a motif borrowed directly from the medieval tradition. And you will see Renaissance pediments, classical statuary, and something else entirely remarkable, an extraordinary profusion of windows. Montacute House has more glass on its facade than almost any other building of its era. The mullioned windows, those long, narrow openings divided by vertical stone bars, stretch across the front of the house in great bands, so that at certain angles the facade appears to be made almost entirely of glass. This was a deliberate choice, and it was a revolutionary one. In medieval England, windows were small. They were designed to keep out the cold, the damp, the draughts that swept across the countryside. Large windows were a luxury, a sign of wealth and confidence, because they meant that you could afford to let the light in without worrying about the cost of heating the rooms behind them. A similar approach to fenestration, the architectural term for the arrangement of windows, can be seen at Hardwicke Hall in Derbyshire, another great Elizabethan house that embraced the new fashion for glass with extraordinary enthusiasm. At Montacute, the windows serve another purpose as well. They announce to anyone approaching the house that this is a building of the modern age, a building that has nothing to hide, a building that welcomes the light of the world into its rooms, rather than shutting it out behind thick walls and narrow slits. The architectural influence at Montacute is, in many ways, Italian. The statues of the 9 worthies that decorate the second-floor facade of the long gallery are set in niches, a feature drawn directly from the Italian Renaissance tradition. The Palazzo degli Uffizi in Florence, built between 1560 and 1581, uses the same device, with statues set into the piers between the windows. At Montacute, the 9 worthies, those legendary figures from ancient and biblical history who were considered the supreme examples of chivalry and virtue, are dressed as Roman soldiers, a further nod to classical antiquity. Beneath the bay windows of the long gallery are curious circular hollows in the stonework, almost certainly intended to receive terracotta medallions, another motif borrowed from the palazzi of Florence. And the bay windows themselves have shallow segmented pediments, a feature that represents one of the earliest occurrences of this particular classical motif anywhere in England. Montacute was, in architectural terms, ahead of its time, but perhaps the most significant feature of the house's design is its symmetry. Medieval English houses were not symmetrical. They grew organically, room by room, wing by wing, added to as needs arose and resources allowed, creating buildings that sprawled and rambled and had no particular sense of geometric order. Montacute House is different. It is built to a plan of perfect symmetry, with paired stair towers standing in the angles between the main body of the house and the wings that project forward. The north and south elevations are identical. The east and west facades, though different in character, are carefully balanced. This symmetry was not merely an aesthetic choice, it was a philosophical statement. It said that order mattered, that proportion mattered, that a house should be as rational and harmonious as the mind that conceived it. And it reflected a broader shift in how the English gentry thought about their homes. In the medieval world, the Great Hall, with its high table at one end and its lower tables at the other, was the centre of social life, and the rest of the house was arranged around it in a way that reflected the rigid hierarchies of feudal society. In the new Renaissance-influenced world, the hierarchy was beginning to dissolve, and with it the architectural logic that had sustained it. At Montacute, the hall no longer had a high end. The building's symmetry expressed a new understanding of social space, one in which equality of form reflected, at least architecturally, a more fluid understanding of social relationship. The plan of the house itself follows the classic Elizabethan E-shape, a layout that was enormously popular during this period. If you were to look down on Montacute from directly above, you would see the main body of the house running roughly north to south, with three wings projecting eastward, creating the three arms of the letter E. On the ground floor were the great hall, the kitchens, and the pantries. On the upper floors were the retiring rooms for the family and their honoured guests. It was a plan that balanced the public and private functions of a great house, keeping the spaces of ceremony and hospitality close to hand, while also providing the family with rooms of genuine privacy and comfort. Now let us walk through the house. Let us follow the route that a guest in 1601 might have taken, arriving at Montacute for the first time, stepping through the doors into a world of stone and light and carefully orchestrated grandeur. In the original layout of the house, the principal entrance was on the east side. You would have approached from the east, walking first through a large outer court, then through a gatehouse, and then into an inner entrance court. The gatehouse itself, sadly, no longer exists. It was demolished at some point in the 17th or 18th century, and all that remains today are the two small pavilions that once flanked it, their ogee-domed roofs and oriel windows and obelisks standing as quiet reminders of a grander approach that has been lost. The courts themselves were not fortified. There were no walls, no drawbridges, no military defences. But they were bordered by ornate balustrading, delicate stone railings that swept around the edges of the courtyards in graceful curves. These balustrades, together with the ogee roofs of the pavilions, were in a sense follies, decorative elements that played a game with the eye. They evoked the fortified approaches of earlier medieval manor houses and castles without actually serving any defensive function. They were architecture as theatre, architecture as memory, a gentle nod to a world that was already passing away. Once inside the house, you would have entered the Great Hall. In a 16th century English mansion, the Great Hall was the beating heart of the household. It was where the family ate, where they received their guests, where the business of daily life was conducted. But by 1598, the Great Hall was beginning to lose its central role. The trend was toward greater privacy, toward separate dining rooms and withdrawing rooms where the family could retreat from the more public spaces of the house. At Montacute, the Great Hall was built on a smaller scale than in earlier mansions, a reflection of this shifting social dynamic. For the first few years after the house was completed, the servants continued to dine in the hall, but Sir Edward Phelips and his family ate in the great chamber on the floor above, a grander, more private space that had become the true centre of ceremonial life. The Great Hall at Montacute contains one of the most remarkable features in the entire house, a stone screen, rendered in the Renaissance style, with Ionic columns whose proportions betray a subtle uncertainty about the classical motifs that were so newly introduced to English architecture. It is the kind of detail that tells you everything you need to know about the moment in which Montacute was built. The mason who carved that screen knew that he was working in a new idiom, a new architectural language borrowed from Italy and France, but he was not entirely fluent in that language yet. He was learning it as he went, experimenting with its forms, trying to find the right proportions, the right relationships between column and capital and entablature. The result is not a masterpiece of classical architecture in the Italian sense. It is something better in some ways. It is a masterpiece of English adaptation, a moment captured in stone when a nation was in the process of reinventing its architectural vocabulary. Leading off from the Great Hall are the drawing room and the parlour. In the 16th and early 17th centuries, the parlour served as the family's private dining room, a space where they could eat with some of their upper servants without the formality and public exposure of dining in the Great Hall. The parlour also had an adjoining bedchamber, originally known as the White Chamber, which later became known as the Round Parlour, and eventually, after centuries of changing use and fashion, the drawing room. These ground-floor rooms illustrate one of the most fascinating aspects of life in a great English house, the way in which rooms changed their purpose over time. A room that was a bedchamber in the 16th century might become a drawing room in the 18th century and a schoolroom in the 19th. The names of the rooms shifted accordingly, and so did their furnishing, their decoration, and their meaning. On the opposite side of the corridor from the Great Hall were two rooms that in the original layout served as the pantry and the buttery. The buttery was the room from which the yeomen of the buttery served beer and candles to those members of the household who were not entitled to drink wine. It had a staircase leading down to the beer cellar below. The pantry was where the yeomen of the pantry served bread. These were service rooms, rooms that operated behind the scenes, invisible to the guests, but essential to the smooth running of the household. Over the centuries, as custom changed and servants were expected to withdraw from the principal areas of the house, these rooms were gradually repurposed. By the early 20th century, when Lord Curzon lived at Montacute, the pantry and buttery had been amalgamated into a single grand dining room, filling a gap that had existed in the house for over 100 years since the great chamber above had been abandoned as a dining space. Now let us climb the principal staircase to the first floor, and let us enter the room that was, in the original design of the house, the most important room in Montacute, the Great Chamber. In a 16th century English mansion, the Great Chamber was the epicenter of ceremony and state. It was positioned at the head of the principal staircase, making it the culmination of a processional route. When important guests arrived at the house, they did not simply walk in through a door and sit down. They were led with all due formality through a sequence of rooms, each one grander than the last, building in importance and magnificence as the procession moved upward through the house until finally the Great Chamber was reached, and the guest understood, in the most visceral and immediate way possible, the wealth, the status, and the ambition of their host. At Montacute, the Great Chamber contains the finest chimney-piece in the house, an elaborate carving in Portland stone that would once have been topped with classical statuary depicting the human form in all its beauty. But those figures are gone now. They were removed during the Victorian era, victims of a prudishness about the naked human body that swept through English society in the 19th century and led to the destruction or concealment of countless works of art that earlier generations had celebrated without embarrassment. The Great Chamber also contains heraldic stained glass in its windows, windows that depict the arms of the families connected to the Phelips by marriage, a genealogical statement rendered in colour and light. These windows are among the few truly original features that survive in the room. During the 18th century, the Great Chamber fell out of use. It was shut up, used as a store, and permitted to decay. By the 19th century, it was in such poor condition that it had to be completely restored, and the restoration was carried out in what the restorers called Elizabethan style, with new strapwork ceilings, new panelling, and new bookcases designed to evoke the original appearance of the room. The result is a space that is, in some ways, a reconstruction rather than an original. But it is a beautiful reconstruction, and the room still retains its original spirit, the sense of a space designed to impress, to awe, to demonstrate the power and sophistication of the family that built it. Adjacent to the great chamber is the anteroom, a small transitional space that divides the great chamber from the main bedroom. In the 19th century, this room was furnished as an armory, its walls lined with weapons and armor, a display of martial prowess that would have been entirely alien to the social atmosphere of the Elizabethan original. Beyond the anteroom lies the garden chamber, a bedroom that looks out onto the gardens. It was here that Lord Curzon slept during his tenure at Montacute in the early 20th century, and it was here that a plumbed bath was installed, hidden inside a wardrobe, one of the very few examples of modern plumbing in the entire house at that time. The first floor also contains the Crimson Chamber and the Hall Chamber, two rooms that together formed one of the most important suites in the house. The Crimson Chamber, described in a 1638 inventory as the withdrawing room, was used by the family to withdraw from the more public ceremonies held in the great chamber. It was a space of retreat, of privacy, of recuperation after the demands of formal hospitality. The Hall Chamber was a principal bedroom, and when the two rooms were used together as a suite, they could accommodate a guest of the highest importance. In fact, the rooms were designed to be accessed through a now blocked door in the great chamber, meaning that a visiting sovereign or person of extraordinary rank could effectively take over the entire suite, including the great chamber itself, for their private use. Although Montacute was equipped in this way for the reception of a visiting queen or king, the honour was never bestowed. By the time the house was completed, in 1601, Queen Elizabeth I was already in the final years of her life, and the Phelips family's moment of greatest political prominence was beginning to wane. Elizabeth died in 1603, and with her death the Elizabethan age came to an end, and a new chapter in English history and in the story of Montacute House began. But before we move forward in time, before we follow the Phelips family through the centuries of change and drama that await them, let us go up one more flight of stairs. Let us climb to the second floor of Montacute House, and let us enter the Long Gallery. The Long Gallery at Montacute House stretches 172 feet from one end to the other. That is 52 meters, more than half the length of a football pitch, and it is the longest surviving long gallery in all of England. Long galleries were a defining feature of great English houses in the 16th and 17th centuries. They served many purposes. They were places of exercise during bad weather, indoor walkways where the family could stretch their legs when the Somerset rain made outdoor activity impossible. They were places of entertainment, where music could be played and conversation held in an atmosphere of grand leisure. They were places of display, where paintings, portraits, and objects of curiosity could be shown off to admiring guests. And they were places of contemplation, long quiet spaces where one could walk and think, letting the rhythm of footsteps on polished wood or stone settle the mind. The Phelips children, it is recorded, would lead their ponies up the stairs to ride in the Long Gallery during wet weather, a charming detail that reveals something important about the way in which these great houses were actually lived in. They were not museums, they were not monuments, they were homes, messy and lively and full of the unpredictable energy of family life. The Long Gallery at Montacute is lit by a continuous wall of glass on its eastern side, a band of windows that stretches the entire length of the room, flooding it with the grey Somerset light. At each end of the gallery, the space is extended by oriel windows, those projecting window bays that jut out from the wall of the building, supported by corbels, small brackets of stone that carry the weight of the window bay from below. From the outside, these oriel windows appear to cling to the wall almost precariously, as though they might detach themselves and fall at any moment. They are one of the most distinctive and photographed features of the house. Today, the Long Gallery serves as an outpost of the National Portrait Gallery in London. Since 1975, when the National Portrait Gallery formed the first of its regional partnerships with historic houses around England, the gallery has been hung with an important collection of historical portraits spanning the reigns of Henry VIII to Charles I. Visitors walk the length of that 172-foot room and look into the faces of kings, queens, courtiers, and conspirators, their painted eyes following the viewer as they pass. It is one of the great experiences that Montacute House offers to those who visit it today, and we will return to it before our story ends. Now, let us leave the architecture behind for a moment, and let us talk about the man who built this house. Sir Edward Phelips died in 1614. He was buried in the churchyard of the village of Montacute, close to the house he had built 13 years earlier. He left behind him a family that was wealthy and landed, a house that was one of the finest in Somerset, and a political legacy that would be remembered for generations. His son, Sir Robert Phelips, inherited Montacute House and continued the family's involvement in English political life. Robert represented various West Country constituencies in Parliament, and he was, by all accounts, a man of strong conviction and fierce independence. He was a staunch Protestant, deeply suspicious of Catholic influence at the court of King James I, and when the possibility of a marriage alliance between the Prince of Wales and a Catholic Spanish princess, known as the Spanish Match, was proposed, Robert Phelips opposed it with a vehemence that brought him into direct conflict with the Crown. The consequences were severe. Robert Phelips was arrested at Montacute House itself, dragged from the very rooms where his father had entertained and received guests, and imprisoned in the Tower of London for his opposition to royal policy. It was a dramatic moment, a moment when the political ambitions that had driven the Phelips family for decades collided violently with the realities of power. But it was also, in a sense, a turning point, because after Robert, the Phelips family's days of national prominence were essentially over. The subsequent generations settled into the quieter rhythms of county gentry life. They represented Somerset in Parliament when called upon. They served in the army and the church when necessity demanded it. They managed their estates, married suitably, raised their children, and lived the comfortable, unremarkable lives that the English gentry had been living for centuries. They were happy, as far as we can tell. They were secure. They were rooted in their community, and comfortable in their place in the social order. But they were no longer making history. For nearly 2 centuries, Montacute House was simply a home, a well-maintained, respectable country mansion inhabited by a respectable county family. The rooms were used, the gardens were tended. The stone aged gracefully in the Somerset climate, mellowing from golden to a softer, more weathered tone. And the world outside changed around it, revolution by revolution, war by war, empire by empire, while Montacute remained quietly, stubbornly itself. But in the 19th century, the peace was broken. And it was broken not by war or politics or any force external to the family, but by something much more intimate, something much more devastating, by madness and by gambling. The man who inherited the Montacute estate in the middle of the 19th century was William Phelips, born in 1823. In his early years as owner, William was a responsible and even enthusiastic steward of the property. He made improvements and renovations to the house, including the construction of the base court, a low service range adjoining the south side of the mansion, and the restoration of the great chamber, which he transformed into a library, furnishing it with bookcases and filling it with books, giving new life to a room that had lain dark and neglected for generations. William was, in those early days, exactly the kind of owner that a house like Montacute needed: attentive, caring, committed to the preservation and improvement of his inheritance. But something changed. Historians are not entirely certain of the precise nature of William Phelips's condition. The records describe him as having become insane, a word that carried a broader and more imprecise meaning in the 19th century than it does today. What is clear is that he developed an addiction to gambling, an addiction so severe and so all-consuming that it eventually destroyed him and very nearly destroyed his family. William Phelips gambled away the family fortune. He gambled away vast tracts of the Montacute estate, the land that his ancestors had acquired over centuries, the fields and meadows and woodland that had sustained the family for generations. He gambled and gambled and gambled, and the debts mounted, and the land was mortgaged, and the fortune that had been built up over 400 years was eroded, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left. Eventually, William Phelips was incarcerated for his own protection, removed from society and from the gambling tables that had consumed him. But by then, the damage was done. In 1875, when his son, another William Phelips, born in 1846, took control of what remained of the estate, the situation was dire. The agricultural rents from the mortgaged land were low, the house was expensive to maintain, and the family's resources were desperately limited. The younger William Phelips did what any responsible owner in his position would have done. He sold the family silver, he sold the artworks, he stripped the house of its portable treasures, converting centuries of accumulated wealth and beauty into cash, using the money to patch and repair and keep the roof on and the walls standing. But it was a losing battle. Year by year the resources dwindled. Year by year the burden of maintaining a great house on a diminishing income grew heavier, and in 1911 the inevitable finally happened. The Phelips family, who had lived at Montacute for over 450 years, were forced to let the house. They could no longer afford to live in it. They rented it out for an annual sum of £650, and they moved out. They left Montacute House, and they never returned. It is worth pausing here for a moment to consider what that moment must have felt like. The Phelips family had been at Montacute since 1460. Their dead were buried in the churchyard. Their arms were carved into the stonework. Their portraits hung on the walls. And now, in 1911, the last of them were walking out through the doors, carrying nothing but whatever they could take with them, leaving behind a house that had been the center of their family's life for nearly half a millennium. The loss must have been staggering, not just of property and wealth, but of identity, of place, of the deep, bone-level sense of belonging that comes from living in the same house as your great-great-great-grandparents. That kind of loss does not appear in financial ledgers. It cannot be measured in pound sterling, but it is, in many ways, the most significant loss of all. The first tenant of Montacute House, after the Phelipses departed, was a man named Robert Davidson. Davidson did not stay long. By 1915, he had departed, and the house was let again, this time to a figure of considerably more fame and notoriety. George Curzon, the first Marquis Curzon of Kedleston. George Curzon was one of the most remarkable and controversial figures in British public life in the early 20th century. He had served as Viceroy of India from 1899 to 1905, ruling over a vast empire with a combination of autocratic authority and genuine passion for Indian culture and heritage. He was a man of enormous intellectual curiosity, a scholar as well as a politician, and he brought to Montacute House a sensibility that was at once aristocratic and deeply engaged with the physical beauty of the buildings he inhabited. Curzon lived at Montacute with his mistress, the novelist Eleanor Glyn. Eleanor Glyn was one of the most famous and scandalous writers of the Edwardian era, known for her romantic novels and her unapologetic celebration of passion and desire. Her presence at Montacute, living openly with a man who was not her husband, was the kind of domestic arrangement that would have caused considerable gossip in the Somerset countryside of that period. Curzon made improvements to the house during his time there. He amalgamated the old pantry and buttery into a dining room, filling a gap that had existed in the house's layout for over a century. He restored a summer house in the gardens. He lived at Montacute as though it were his own, and he brought to it a quality of attention and care that the house had not received for years. But Curzon did not own Montacute. He was a tenant, and tenants, however distinguished, do not have the same stake in a property as owners. When he left, his improvements remained, but the fundamental problem of the house, the problem of who would pay for its long-term maintenance and preservation, remained unsolved. After Curzon, there was another tenant, the American writer Henry Lane Eno, who lived at Montacute until his death there in 1928. And then, in 1929, the house was offered for sale. And we return now to that autumn afternoon with which we began our story. The man with the clipboard, the empty rooms, the silent chimneys, the scrap value of £5,882. In 1929, England was in the grip of a crisis that was devastating the country's great houses. The combination of rising maintenance costs, declining agricultural rents, punishing inheritance taxes, and the social upheavals of the Great War had made it increasingly impossible for the aristocracy and gentry to maintain their vast estates. House after house, mansion after mansion, was being demolished, sold for parts, or simply abandoned to ruin. The scale of destruction was extraordinary. Between the end of the First World War and the outbreak of the Second, it is estimated that 1 in 10 of England's great country houses was demolished or severely damaged beyond repair. Montacute House was in grave danger of becoming one of them. The house was offered for sale in 1929, and for 2 years it sat on the market, unsold. Its historic contents and furnishing, with the exception of the Phelips family portraits, were disposed of. The silver was gone. The furniture was gone. The paintings were gone. The tapestries, the china, the accumulated material evidence of 4 centuries of Phelips' life, stripped away and scattered. And the house itself, that magnificent shell of Ham Hill stone, stood empty on the Somerset hillside, waiting for a buyer who never came, and facing the very real possibility that it would be broken apart and carted away, stone by stone, to be reused in other buildings elsewhere. It was during this period of uncertainty and vulnerability that the house came to the attention of a man named Ernest Cook. Ernest Cook was a philanthropist, a wealthy man who had made his fortune in the coal industry and who devoted a significant portion of that fortune to the preservation of historic buildings and works of art. Cook had already acquired several country houses and works of art during this period, and he understood, perhaps better than almost anyone in England at that time, the urgency of the preservation crisis facing the nation's architectural heritage. In 1931, Cook purchased Montacute House, and then, in an act of extraordinary generosity, he presented it to the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, and from that society it passed to the National Trust. The National Trust, founded in 1895, was a charity dedicated to the preservation of England's natural and historic landscape. In the early decades of its existence, it had focused primarily on landscapes and open countryside, but by the 1930s it was beginning to acquire country houses as well, recognizing that these buildings were as much a part of England's heritage as the hills and forests and coastlines. Montacute House was one of the earliest of these acquisitions, one of the first great houses to come under the Trust's care. But it came empty. It came without furnishing, without art, without the material culture that gives a house its life and meaning. And it came without the financial endowment that the Trust would later require of all properties it accepted, a fund of money set aside to pay for ongoing maintenance and repair. James Lees Milne, the Secretary of the Trust's Country House Committee, and one of the most influential figures in the preservation of English country houses in the 20th century, described Montacute as an empty and rather embarrassing white elephant. It was a phrase that captured, with characteristic precision and wit, the awkward reality of the Trust's situation. Here was one of the finest Elizabethan mansions in England. Here was a building of extraordinary architectural significance, a rare survivor from an era when so many of its peers had been destroyed. And here was the National Trust, a charity with limited resources and an uncertain future, trying to figure out what on earth to do with it. The answer, in the end, was surprisingly simple: open it to the public. In 1932, Montacute House opened its doors to visitors for the first time. People came, not in enormous numbers at first, but steadily, quietly, drawn by the beauty of the house and the drama of its story. They walked through the rooms, they climbed the stairs, they stood in the long gallery and looked out through the great windows at the Somerset countryside. And they understood, perhaps intuitively, that they were standing in something precious, something that had come very close to being lost. During the Second World War, Montacute House was requisitioned by the British Army. American soldiers were billeted in the surrounding parkland in the months before the D-Day landings in June 1944, using the gardens and grounds of a 400-year-old English mansion as a staging area for the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. It is one of the stranger footnotes in the history of the Second World War, and it adds another layer to the already layered story of Montacute House. After the war ended, the house returned to the care of the National Trust, and the slow, patient work of restoration and conservation began in earnest. On the 19th of April 1961, Montacute House was designated a Grade 1 listed building, the highest possible listing grade in England, a formal recognition of its outstanding architectural and historic significance. The gardens and parkland were entered onto the Register of Historic Parks and Gardens of Special Historic Interest on the 1st of June 1984, receiving the same Grade 1 designation. And in 1975, a partnership was formed between Montacute House and the National Portrait Gallery in London, the first of what would become a nationwide network of regional partnerships between the gallery and historic houses. The Long Gallery, that magnificent 172-foot space, was redecorated and restored and hung with an important collection of historical portraits from the reign of Henry VIII to that of Charles I. For the first time in centuries, the gallery was filled with art again, with faces looking out from canvases, with the accumulated visual record of Tudor and Stuart England displayed in a space that had been designed 400 years earlier for exactly this kind of display. Today, Montacute House receives over 183,000 visitors a year. They come from all over England and from all over the world. They come to see the architecture, the gardens, the Long Gallery and its portraits. They come to film. The house and its grounds have been used as a location for numerous films and television productions, including scenes from the 1995 film adaptation of Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, the 2004 film The Libertine, a television adaptation of The Hound of the Baskervilles filmed in 2000, and the BBC's adaptation of Hilary Mantel's novel Wolf Hall, filmed in 2014. The house has even inspired the fictional Tottington Hall in the Wallace and Gromit film The Curse of the Were-Rabbit. It is, in short, a place that has become deeply embedded in the cultural life of Britain, a place that means something, a place that resonates. Now let us return to the gardens, because the gardens of Montacute House are as much a part of the story as the house itself. The gardens were well established by 1633, and by 1667 several walled gardens and courts had been added, along with established orchards and stone gate lodges. Over the centuries, the gardens were reshaped and replanted many times, reflecting the changing fashions of English garden design and the changing tastes and resources of the people who tended them. The former entrance forecourt, the space that once led up to the now demolished gatehouse, has been transformed into a garden. The two pavilions with their ogee domed roofs still stand at the northeast and southeast corners of this space, their oriel windows and obelisks echoing the architectural motifs of the house itself. The garden planting within the forecourt and in the slightly sunken grassed parterre was the work of Mrs. Ellen Phelips, who lived at Montacute from the 1840s until her death in 1911, and her gardener, Mr. Pridham, who had previously worked for her at Coker Court. Ellen Phelips was the last of the Phelips women to live at Montacute, and her contribution to the gardens was significant. The avenue of clipped yews that reinforces the older avenue of mature trees stretching away from the outer walls of the forecourt dates from her time. So do the clipped yews that outline the grassed parterre. And one of the most photographed features of the Montacute gardens, a giant hedge with a distinctive melted shape, as though it had been left out in the rain and slowly dripped and sagged, was inspired not by Ellen, but by an entirely natural event. A freak snowfall in 1947 that pressed and compressed the hedge into its strange organic form. The sunken parterre garden, with its Jacobean-style central fountain, was designed in 1894 by Robert Shackleton Balfour, an architect whose dated design is preserved in the library of the Royal Institute of British Architects. The mixed borders in the East Court were replanted in the 20th century by Phyllis Race of Tintinhull, who replaced an earlier colour scheme laid down by the legendary garden designer Vita Sackville West, with more vivid, more powerful colours that suited the Somerset light better. Today, the gardens and parkland of Montacute House cover around 106 hectares, or 260 acres, of which 4 hectares, or about 10 acres, are more formally laid out gardens. These are the remains of the 121 hectares, or 300 acres, of parkland that originally surrounded the house. The loss of parkland over the centuries is a common story among English country houses, as land was sold off, built over, or simply allowed to revert to agricultural use. But what remains at Montacute is still beautiful, still evocative, still capable of transporting the visitor back in time to a world when great houses sat at the centres of vast estates, surrounded by landscapes that were as carefully designed and maintained as the buildings themselves. The listing designations attached to Montacute and its grounds reflect the extraordinary significance of the entire estate. The house itself is Grade 1 listed. The gardens and parkland are Grade 1 on the Register of Historic Parks and Gardens. The 2 pavilions are listed. The gateway flanking the east forecourt is listed. The South Lodge is listed at Grade 2 star. And numerous other features of the estate, from the stables and the orangery to the steps leading down to the sunken garden, from the pool and fountain in the north garden to the walled enclosures, are all listed at Grade 2. It is one of the most comprehensively listed estates in Somerset. And it is a testament to the extraordinary survival of a place that, in 1929, was worth less than £6,000 in scrap. But there is a dimension to Montacute House that we have not yet fully explored, a dimension that goes beyond the architecture, beyond the political drama, beyond even the nail-biting story of the house's survival, and that is the dimension of daily life. Because Montacute House was not built to be admired from a distance. It was not built to be a monument or a museum or a curiosity. It was built to be lived in. And the story of how people actually lived inside Montacute House, from the grand ceremonial rhythms of the Elizabethan era to the quieter, more intimate routines of the 19th and 20th centuries, is one of the most revealing and fascinating aspects of its long history. Let us imagine ourselves back in the early 17th century, in the years immediately after the house was completed. Sir Edward Phelips and his family are in residence. The household is at full stretch, and the business of running a great Elizabethan mansion is in full swing. A household like Montacute would have required a substantial staff to maintain and operate. The number of servants in a house of this size and status would have been considerable, likely somewhere in the range of 20 to 40 people, depending on the season and the demands of the household. At the top of the servant hierarchy stood the butler, or as he might have been called in this period, the steward. The steward was the senior servant in the house, responsible for the overall management of the household, for the finances, for the provisioning of the kitchen, and for the smooth running of the entire domestic operation. He would have been a man of some education and considerable experience, likely drawn from the pool of professional household managers who moved between the great houses of England, carrying with them the knowledge and skills that each employer needed. Below the steward came the housekeeper, a senior female servant who was responsible for the domestic management of the house itself, the cleaning, the linen, the candles, the maintenance of the rooms and their furnishing. The housekeeper at Montacute would have overseen a staff of housemaids and chambermaids, women who cleaned and polished and dusted and aired and made beds and emptied chamber pots and performed the 1,000 small tasks that kept a great house in order. The kitchen was the heart of the household's provisioning operation, and it would have been presided over by a cook, or perhaps a succession of cooks, who was responsible for preparing the food that sustained the family, the servants, and any guests who might be visiting. Elizabethan cooking was a complex and demanding art. The meals served at a house like Montacute would have been elaborate affairs, with multiple courses, each one carefully orchestrated to present the household in the most favourable light. Meat was central to the English diet of this period, roasted, boiled, stewed, and baked in a variety of ways. Fish, when available, supplemented the meat dishes. Vegetables, fruits, and herbs were grown in the kitchen gardens and used both in cooking and in the preparation of medicines and preservatives. The pantry and buttery, those 2 rooms on the ground floor of Montacute that we mentioned earlier, were the nerve centre of this food operation. The pantry was where the bread was stored and served, and the buttery was where the beer and ale were kept and dispensed. Beer was not a luxury in Elizabethan England. It was a necessity. Water was often unsafe to drink, and beer, even the weak, low-alcohol beer that was the daily staple of ordinary households, was a far safer alternative. The yeoman of the buttery, the servant responsible for the buttery's operation, would have dispensed beer throughout the day to the lower members of the household, while wine, a more expensive and prestigious drink, was reserved for the family and their honoured guests. The gardens of Montacute would have been tended by a team of gardeners, men who maintained not only the ornamental gardens, but also the kitchen gardens that provided much of the household's food supply. Elizabethan gardens were formal affairs, carefully designed and meticulously maintained, with geometric patterns, clipped hedges, and a strong sense of order and control. The gardens at Montacute were well established by 1633, and by 1667 they had been expanded to include several walled gardens and courts, along with established orchards that would have produced apples, pears, and other fruits for the household's use. Beyond the kitchen gardens and the orchards, the parkland that surrounded the house would have been managed for deer hunting and other field sports, activities that were central to the social and recreational life of the English gentry. The 300 acres of parkland that originally surrounded Montacute would have been home to deer, and the hunting of those deer would have been one of the principal recreations available to Sir Edward Phelips and his guests. Hunting in Elizabethan England was not merely sport, it was ritual, it was social bonding, it was a demonstration of fitness, skill, and masculine prowess. And it was, for a man like Sir Edward Phelips, a way of entertaining his guests and cementing the social relationships on which his political career depended. The daily rhythm of life in Montacute House would have followed a pattern that was broadly similar to that observed in other great English houses of the period. The household would have risen early, well before dawn in the winter months, with the servants beginning their work in the grey light of a Somerset morning. Fires would have been laid and lit in the principal rooms, candles would have been set out, and the business of preparing for the day would have begun. Breakfast for the family would have been a relatively modest affair compared to the elaborate meals that followed later in the day. A piece of bread, perhaps some cheese or cold meat, and a cup of ale or wine. The Elizabethans did not eat breakfast as we understand it today. It was a perfunctory meal, a quick sustenance before the real business of the day began. The main meal of the day, dinner, would have been served in the middle of the afternoon, perhaps around 2 or 3 o'clock. This was the meal at which the household assembled in its full splendor. The family and their guests would have dined in the great chamber on the first floor, the room we described earlier as the epicenter of ceremony and state. The table would have been set with the family's best silver and plate. The food would have been presented with care and artistry, and the meal would have been accompanied by music, played by servants or by musicians hired for the occasion. Dinner at a house like Montacute was not simply a meal. It was a performance, a demonstration of the family's wealth, taste, and social standing. The number of courses, the quality of the food, the richness of the table setting, and the elegance of the service all communicated a message to the guests. You are in a house of consequence. You are being entertained by people who matter. Supper, the evening meal, would have been a lighter affair, eaten later in the day, perhaps in the parlor on the ground floor or in one of the smaller rooms on the first floor. By this time, the formal demands of the day would have relaxed somewhat, and the atmosphere might have been more intimate, more conversational, more relaxed than the grand ceremony of dinner. The evenings after supper would have been spent in various ways. Music might have been played. Books might have been read aloud. Conversation might have continued by candlelight in the warmth of the great chamber or the parlor. And eventually, as the candles burned low and the Somerset night drew in, the family would have retired to their bedchambers, and the servants would have begun the long process of cleaning up after the day, extinguishing fires, washing dishes, and preparing the house for the morning that would come again, as it always did, with the same relentless regularity. This was the rhythm of life at Montacute House in the early 17th century. It was a rhythm that changed very little over the following 200 years. The specific foods might change, the fashions of furnishing and decoration might evolve, the political fortunes of the family might rise and fall, but the basic structure of daily life, the cycle of waking and working and eating and sleeping and tending and maintaining, remained remarkably stable across the generations. What did change, and changed dramatically, was the relationship between the family and the house itself. In the early years, when Sir Edward Phelips was alive and the family was at the height of its influence, Montacute House was a living, breathing centre of social and political activity. Guests came. Dinners were held. The house was full of life and noise and purpose. But as the generations passed and the family's prominence declined, the house gradually became quieter. The guest rooms were used less often. The grand dinners became less frequent. The staff was reduced, economies were made, and the house began, almost imperceptibly, to contract around the family that lived in it, like a shell around a creature that was slowly shrinking. By the 19th century, when William Phelips inherited the estate and began his disastrous gambling addiction, the house was already living on its reserves. The silver, the art, the accumulated treasures of 4 centuries were being sold off, piece by piece, to pay the mounting debts. And the house itself, that magnificent shell of Ham Hill stone, was beginning to feel the effects of reduced maintenance and diminishing care. It is worth considering, for a moment, what the interior of Montacute House looked like in the Victorian era, before the stripping began in earnest. The rooms would have been furnished in the style of the time, with heavy Victorian furniture, dark wood and rich upholstery, replacing the lighter, more elegant furnishing of earlier periods. The walls would have been hung with portraits, many of them of the Phelips family themselves, a gallery of faces stretching back through the generations. The mantelpieces would have been crowded with ornaments and curiosities, the accumulated clutter of a family that had lived in one place for centuries. The great chamber, which William Phelips had restored and converted into a library, would have been lined with bookcases and filled with books, a quiet refuge from the noise and bustle of the rest of the house. It would have been, in its own way, a beautiful space, if not the grand ceremonial room that Edward Phelips had originally intended. Victorian prudery had already done its damage by this point. The classical statuary that once adorned the chimney-piece of the great chamber had been removed, and the room had lost something of its original grandeur as a result. But it had gained something too. A warmth, an intimacy, a sense of being a room that was actually used and loved rather than merely displayed. And then the stripping began. The silver went first, melted down and sold. Then the paintings, removed from the walls and auctioned off. Then the furniture, the tapestries, the china, the books, all of it dispersed, scattered, lost to the impersonal machinery of the auction house and the antiques market. By the time the house was offered for sale in 1929, it was almost empty. A shell. A beautiful shell, but a shell nonetheless, stripped of the material culture that had given it meaning and life for 400 years. The portraits of the Phelips family, those faces that had looked down from the walls for generations, were the only things that were saved from the general dispersal. They were kept together, preserved as a unit, a visual record of the family that had built and inhabited and loved this house. Everything else was gone. It is a loss that cannot be adequately described in words, because what was lost at Montacute was not simply objects. It was not simply furniture and silver and paintings. What was lost was the accumulated material evidence of 4 centuries of human life. The marks that people leave behind them, the things they touch and use and treasure and display. The record, written not in words but in objects, of how they lived, what they valued, who they were. That record at Montacute was almost entirely destroyed. But there is another side to this story. Because while the material culture of Montacute was being stripped away, the building itself, the stone and the timber and the plaster and the glass, was being preserved. And it is the building, in the end, that matters most. Because a house can be refurnished. A house can be replastered and repainted and redecorated. But a house cannot be rebuilt, not really, not without losing the very thing that makes it what it is. The original fabric of Montacute House, the Ham Hill stone that was quarried from the hills of Somerset in the 1590s, the windows that let in the light, the walls that have stood for over 400 years, that fabric is irreplaceable. And it survived. It survived the gambling of William Phelips. It survived the stripping of the Victorian era. It survived the scrap valuation of 1929. It survived the war. And it survives today, solid and enduring, on the Somerset hillside, doing what it was always meant to do, standing, being there, witnessing the passage of time. Now, let us talk about the Clifton-Maybank corridor, because it is one of the most fascinating and least well-known features of Montacute House, and it tells a story that is, in microcosm, the story of how English country houses evolved and adapted over the centuries. In the original design of Montacute, as in all Elizabethan houses, there were no corridors. The rooms led directly from one to another, a door opening from one room into the next, with no intervening passage. This was the standard arrangement in English domestic architecture of the period, and it had both practical and social implications. Practically, it meant that there was no way to move through the house without passing through occupied rooms. A servant going about their business might have to walk through the family's private quarters. A guest might stumble accidentally into a room that was not intended for their eyes. Privacy, in the modern sense, was almost non-existent. Socially, the arrangement reflected the more open, more communal nature of Elizabethan domestic life. In a world without corridors, the boundaries between different spaces, between public and private, between family and servant, were blurrier and more fluid than they would become in later centuries. But as the 17th and 18th centuries progressed, attitudes to privacy changed. The desire for separation between the public and private spaces of a house grew stronger, and architects began to incorporate corridors into their designs, creating passages that allowed movement through a house without the need to pass through occupied rooms. At Montacute, this transformation came relatively late, in 1787, and it came in a particularly ingenious way. Edward Phelips, the owner at that time, purchased stonework from a nearby mansion at Clifton Maybank, which was being partly demolished, and used that stonework to rebuild the west front of Montacute House. The new facade incorporated a corridor, a covered passage that ran along the ground floor, giving privacy to the rooms on either side. And because the new facade was now the most impressive and accessible face of the house, the entrance was effectively moved from the east side to the west. The house was, in a sense, turned around. The original east facade, with its Dutch gables and its 9 worthies and its magnificent bands of windows, which had once been the first thing a visitor saw as they approached the house, was now looking out over a lawn and flower borders rather than the entrance courtyard. It became a facade to be admired rather than a facade to be entered through. And the new Clifton Maybank corridor became one of the most important architectural features of the house, connecting the 2 staircases, providing access to the principal rooms on both the ground floor and the first floor, and creating a new logic of circulation and movement that would endure for the next 240 years. The story of the Clifton Maybank corridor is, in miniature, the story of how great English houses adapted to changing times. They did not simply stand still. They were not frozen in the moment of their creation. They changed, evolved, were added to and altered and rebuilt, generation by generation, in response to the needs and tastes and resources of the people who lived in them. And these changes, layered one upon another over the centuries, gave the houses their depth and their richness and their complexity. A house like Montacute is not a single thing. It is a palimpsest, a text written over and over again, with each generation adding its own layer to the ones that came before. The Elizabethan stonework beneath the Victorian plaster, the medieval concept of the buttery and the pantry beneath the Edwardian dining room that Lord Curzon created, the original east facade beneath the later west facade that the Clifton Maybank corridor made possible. Layer upon layer upon layer, stretching back 4 centuries, each one telling a different part of the story. To read Montacute House is to read the history of English domestic life itself, compressed into a single building, written in stone and timber and glass. Let us now turn our attention to something we have touched on but not yet fully explored, the gardens and the landscape of Montacute, and what they tell us about the people who created and maintained them. English gardens are, in many ways, as significant as English houses. They are designed spaces, shaped by human hands and human intentions, and they reflect the tastes, the aesthetics, and the cultural values of the people who made them just as surely as the buildings they surround. The gardens at Montacute House have a long history, stretching back to at least the early 17th century. By 1633, they were well established, and by 1667 they had been expanded to include several walled gardens and courts, along with orchards and gate lodges. The original design of the gardens, like the original design of the house, is lost to us. We do not know exactly what they looked like in the early 1600s, when Sir Edward Phelips first walked through them. But we can infer from the general principles of Elizabethan garden design, and from the surviving features of the Montacute landscape, something of their character and layout. Elizabethan gardens were formal gardens. They were designed according to principles of symmetry and geometric order, with hedgerows clipped into precise shapes, pathways laid out in regular patterns, and the natural landscape tamed and controlled into a vision of human rationality and harmony. They were gardens that expressed the same values as the houses they surrounded: order, proportion, beauty, and the triumph of human will over the wildness of nature. The gardens at Montacute would have included kitchen gardens, where vegetables and herbs were grown for the household's use. They would have included orchards, where fruit trees were cultivated and tended. They would have included pleasure gardens, where the family could walk and relax and enjoy the beauty of the Somerset countryside in a controlled and aesthetically pleasing environment. And they would have included the parkland, that great expanse of managed woodland and grassland that surrounded the house and provided the setting for hunting and other field sports. Over the centuries, the gardens were reshaped many times. The gate lodges that originally accompanied the walled gardens were removed in the 18th century, a sign of changing tastes in garden design as the formal, geometric style of the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods gave way to the more naturalistic, landscape-inspired gardens of the Georgian era. The parkland shrank, as we have noted, from 300 acres to the 260 acres that remain today, as land was sold off or converted to other uses. And the planting itself changed repeatedly, as each generation of owners brought their own tastes and preferences to bear on the landscape. But one of the most remarkable aspects of the Montacute Gardens is the way in which they preserve layers of history, much as the house itself does. The sunken parterre garden, with its Jacobean-style fountain, bears the imprint of Robert Shackleton Balfour, who designed it in 1894. The mixed borders in the East Court bear the imprint of Phyllis Rice, who replanted them in the 20th century, replacing Vita Sackville West's earlier colour scheme with more vivid, more robust colours. The avenue of clipped yews dates from the work of Mrs. Ellen Phelips and her gardener, Mr. Pridham. And the famous melted hedge, that extraordinary natural sculpture that has become one of the most photographed features of the gardens, was created not by any human hand, but by a freak snowfall in 1947, which compressed and distorted the hedge into its strange, organic shape. Gardens, unlike houses, are never finished. They are always in the process of becoming. They grow and change and decay and are replanted and renewed, season by season, year by year, in an endless cycle of creation and destruction that mirrors the larger rhythms of life itself. The gardens at Montacute are a testament to this process. They are a living record of 4 centuries of gardening, of design and redesign, of human creativity and natural change, all compressed into a landscape of remarkable beauty and complexity. And they are, for many of the 183,000 visitors who come to Montacute each year, the highlight of their visit. There is something about a great English garden that speaks to something deep in the national psyche, a sense of order within wildness, a sense of beauty that is neither entirely natural nor entirely artificial, but something in between, a sense that the landscape has been loved and tended and cared for, generation after generation, by people who understood that beauty was not a luxury but a necessity. Montacute's gardens offer all of this and more. They offer a window into the way in which the English have thought about their relationship with the land for centuries, not as conquerors, not as exploiters, but as gardeners, as stewards, as people who understood that the landscape they inherited was not simply raw material to be used, but a living thing to be nurtured, shaped, and ultimately returned to those who would come after them. And that, perhaps, is the deepest lesson that Montacute House and its gardens have to teach us, not merely about architecture, not merely about history, but about the relationship between human beings and the places they inhabit, about the marks we leave behind us, about the things we build and the things we grow and the things we preserve, not for ourselves, but for the generations yet to come. Montacute House stands today as it has stood for over 4 centuries, solid, patient, enduring, on its Somerset hillside, watching the world change around it. The Phelips family is gone. The silver and the art and the furniture are gone. The gatehouse is gone. The original entrance court is gone. But the house remains. The stone remains. The light remains, falling through windows that were set 400 years ago. And the story remains, alive and vivid, told and retold by everyone who walks through its doors and feels, for a moment, the weight of all those centuries pressing gently against their shoulders like a hand reaching across time. This is Montacute House, and this is why it matters. If you have enjoyed this journey through the story of Montacute House, if the story of the Phelips family and the dramatic survival of this extraordinary building has moved you or fascinated you or made you want to know more, please subscribe to this channel. There are many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories of great houses and the extraordinary people who built them, lived in them, loved them, and lost them. Stories that deserve to be heard. And if you have a favorite mansion or estate that you would like to see featured in a future video, write to us in the comments below. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for watching. And thank you for helping to keep these stories alive.